Money doesn't buy class. It just buys a louder microphone for your insecurities. Nevaeh learned that rule working double shifts at a restaurant, catering to the city's worst people, dressed in their absolute best. But tonight, a spoiled heiress with a dangerous last name pushed a little too hard. She expected tears. She expected frantic apologies. What she got instead was a brutal, quiet humiliation that sucked the air out of the room and caught the eye of the one man nobody ever crossed. Porcelain clinking against silver was a sound Neve Brown had grown to despise. It was a sharp, brittle noise that perfectly matched the atmosphere of Laura, an upscale dining room nestled in the city's financial district. The restaurant operated on a very specific, unspoken business model, overcharging criminals for mediocre risotto so they could feel like aristocrats. Nevaeh shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, ignoring the dull, throbbing ache radiating up her calves. She was 26, running on 4 hours of sleep, and wearing a stiff white button-down collar that chafed her neck. Her cynicism wasn't an attitude problem, it was a survival mechanism. When you spend 40 hours a week serving truffles to men who break kneecaps for a living, you stop believing in the glamour of the underworld. To Nevaeh, the Mafia wasn't a romance novel or a gritty cinema masterpiece. It was just a collection of violent tax evaders who tipped poorly and chewed with their mouths open. "Table 4 needs a wipe down," hissed Gerard, the floor manager, as he breezed past her holding a stack of leather-bound menus. His forehead was slick with sweat, a permanent feature whenever the reservations list included heavy hitters. "And fix your apron, Brown. The Perrys just pulled up with valet." Neve didn't sigh, though she wanted to. She reached back, tightening the strings of her black apron, and grabbed a damp linen cloth. The Perry family. 5 years ago, the name would have cleared the restaurant. Under the old man, Arthur Perry, they were brutal, unrefined, and loud. But Arthur had suffered a massive stroke 6 months prior, leaving the empire to his eldest son, Leandro. Leandro Perry was different. He didn't wear velvet tracksuits or scream at subordinates in public. He wore tailored wool coats, spoke softly, and treated his illicit enterprises like a Fortune 500 company. The violence was still there, but it was corporate now, sanitized, kept out of the dining rooms. Nevaeh finished wiping down table 4 just as the heavy oak doors of Laura swung open. A sudden hush fell over the front of the house. The ambient chatter of stockbrokers and minor racketeers dialed down a notch. Nevaeh retreated to the waiter's station, folding her arms as she watched the host practically trip over his own loafers to greet the newcomers. Leandro Perry walked in first. He wasn't exceptionally tall, nor was he built like a heavyweight fighter, but he carried a heavy, dense gravity. His suit was dark charcoal, immaculate, but he wore it like he didn't care about it. His eyes, a flat, unremarkable brown, swept the room with clinical detachment. He wasn't looking for threats. He was cataloging assets. Right behind him, practically stepping on his heels, was his younger sister, Stella. If Leandro was the cold reality of the new organization, Stella was the desperate ghost of the old one. She wore a slip dress that cost more than Nevaeh's annual rent, draped in an oversized mink coat, despite it being a mild October evening. Her heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood. She carried herself with a frantic, performative arrogance. Her chin tilted up so high she looked like she was drowning. Stella had no actual power in the family business. Women rarely did in their circle, so she overcompensated by terrorizing civilians. I explicitly said a booth by the window, Stella's voice carried across the quiet restaurant. It was a nasal, grating sound. Why are we being led to the center of the floor? Are we on display? The host stammered, his face draining of color. Ms. Perry, I apologize. The window booths were— It's fine, Leandro interrupted. His voice was a low rumble, barely above a whisper, yet it easily cut through his sister's shrill complaint. Sit down, Stella. Stella flushed, her jaw tightening, but she slid into the leather chair the host pulled out for her. She immediately began rearranging the silverware, finding fault with the symmetry. Leandro took the seat across from her, pulling a sleek black smartphone from his pocket and setting it face down on the tablecloth. Gerard materialized beside Nevaeh at the waiter's station, grabbing her elbow with clammy fingers. You're on table 4. Do not mess this up. The sister is in a mood, and if she throws a tantrum, Leandro might decide to make an example out of the establishment. Flatter her. Agree with her. Go. Nevaeh peeled Gerard's fingers off her sleeve. I'm a waitress, Gerard, not a hostage negotiator. I'll get their drink orders. She grabbed a silver tray and smoothed her expression into the blank, pleasant mask she reserved for terrible people. Walking toward table 4, she felt the eyes of the other patrons lingering on the Perrys. The tension in the room was thick, like humidity before a thunderstorm. Nevaeh ignored it. She didn't care about their turf wars or their body counts. She just wanted to get through the shift, count her tips, and go home to her cat. Good evening, Nevaeh said, stopping a polite distance from the table. Can I start you off with some sparkling water or a cocktail? Leandro looked up. He didn't smile, but he didn't glare either. Just tap water is fine, and a black coffee. Tap water? Stella scoffed, looking at Nevaeh as if she had just crawled out of a storm drain. Don't be ridiculous, Leandro. Bring us a bottle of the San Pellegrino, and make sure the lime wedges are actually fresh. Last time I was here, they tasted like they'd been sitting in a fridge since Tuesday. Nevaeh nodded once, her face neutral. Right away, she turned on her heel, already feeling the familiar, exhausting weight of a long night settling onto her shoulders. Stella Perry had something to prove tonight, and Nevaeh had just become the chosen audience. Service was an exercise in systematic abuse. Over the next 45 minutes, Stella sent back 2 appetizers, complained about the ambient lighting, and snapped her fingers at a busboy until the poor teenager nearly dropped a tray of water glasses. Through it all, Leandro remained silently detached. He drank his black coffee, ate a dry piece of sourdough bread, and occasionally checked his phone. He wasn't ignoring his sister, but he wasn't encouraging her either. He watched her behavior the way a scientist observes a rat in a maze. Curious, but emotionally uninvolved, Nevaeh navigated the minefield with practiced apathy. When Stella claimed the carpaccio was sliced too thick, Nevaeh whisked it away without arguing. When Stella demanded a new napkin because hers felt stiff, Nevaeh replaced it in under 30 seconds. She offered no resistance, no ego, just cold, mechanical compliance. But compliance wasn't what Stella wanted. Stella wanted subjugation. She wanted a reaction. The main courses arrived. A rare ribeye for Leandro, and a delicate sea bass for Stella. Nevaeh placed the plates down silently from the left side, following the strict choreography of fine dining. Wait, Stella barked, just as Nevaeh was stepping back. Nevaeh paused, keeping her hands clasped behind her back. Is there an issue with the dish, Ms. Perry? Stella picked up her silver fork and poked at the fish. She sneered. "What is this?" "The pan-seared Chilean sea bass," Nevaeh replied evenly. "Served with a lemon caper beurre blanc and micro-greens." "It looks dry," Stella said, her voice rising in volume. Several heads at nearby tables turned. A group of men in sharp suits sitting 3 tables over, likely associates or underlings of the Perrys, stopped talking to watch the show. Stella noticed the audience, and her posture stiffened. She was leaning into the performance now. "I can ask the kitchen to prepare a fresh—" "I don't want a fresh one," Stella interrupted, dropping the fork onto the plate with a loud clatter. "I want to know why you thought it was acceptable to bring this out here in the first place. Are you blind or just stupid?" Nevaeh kept her breathing steady. She felt the sudden drop in temperature in the restaurant. The ambient chatter died entirely. Even the bartender stopped shaking a martini. "I apologize if it isn't to your liking," Nevaeh said, her voice intentionally quiet, forcing Stella to strain to hear her. "I'll take it back." She reached for the plate. Stella's hand shot out, her manicured nails digging painfully into Nevaeh's wrist. Nevaeh froze. Physical contact was a hard line. Her eyes snapped to Stella's, shedding the polite waitressing mask for a split second, revealing the cold, exhausted woman underneath. "Don't touch the plate yet, sweetie," Stella said, her tone dripping with venom. She squeezed Nevaeh's wrist harder. "I asked you a question. Are you stupid? Because you'd have to be stupid to work a job like this, fetching food for people who actually matter. You're basically just furniture that breathes. A prop." Leandro slowly set his coffee cup down on the saucer. The ceramic click sounded like a gunshot in the dead, silent room. He didn't say a word. He just leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach, his dark eyes locked on Nevaeh's face. He was waiting. Stella released Nevaeh's wrist and picked up her crystal water goblet. "You know what? I think you need to clean up your act. You're filthy. Your uniform is wrinkled. Your shoes look like they came from a thrift store. It's offensive to my appetite." With a flick of her wrist, Stella tilted the goblet. Ice-cold water cascaded down the front of Nevaeh's crisp white apron, soaking through to her button-down shirt and dripping onto her black slacks. The ice cubes clattered against the hardwood floor. A collective gasp echoed from a nearby table. Gerard, standing near the kitchen doors, looked like he was about to pass out. "Oops," Stella said, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "Looks like you made a mess. You should probably get on your knees and wipe that up before someone slips." Nevaeh stood perfectly still. The cold water seeped into her skin, sending a shiver through her chest. But she didn't break eye contact with Stella. She didn't cry. She didn't flush with embarrassment. Her mind, hardened by years of dealing with abusive landlords, medical debt collectors, and aggressive drunks, went entirely still. She looked at Stella Perry. Really looked at her. She saw the microscopic tremor in Stella's hands. She saw the way Stella's eyes darted toward the table of underlings, desperate to see if they were impressed. She saw the heavy, suffocating shadow of Leandro Perry sitting across from her and realized the truth. Stella wasn't a predator. She was prey, frantically trying to convince the jungle she had teeth. Nevaeh wasn't going to get on her knees, and she wasn't going to yell either. Yelling was what Stella wanted. Yelling meant Stella had successfully affected her. "Well?" Stella demanded, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of Nevaeh's absolute, unnerving silence. "Are you deaf?" I said, "clean it up." Neve slowly reached into the pocket of her soaked apron. The room held its collective breath. Some patrons later claimed they thought the waitress was reaching for a weapon. It was that kind of neighborhood, and that kind of tension. Instead, Neve pulled out a perfectly folded dry linen napkin. She didn't drop it to the floor. She didn't dab at her soaked shirt. She took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between herself and the table. She bypassed Stella entirely and stopped beside Leandro's chair. "Sir," Neve said, her voice conversational, steady, and devoid of any tremble. She didn't look at Stella. She addressed Leandro directly, speaking to him as if they were discussing the weather. "The ribeye is cooked exactly to a medium-rare finish, as requested by the chef, though I noted you prefer well done. The kitchen can butterfly it and return it to the grill if you prefer." Leandro tilted his head, his dark eyes studying her. He looked at the water dripping from her hem onto his polished leather shoes. Then he looked at her face. "The steak is fine," he said quietly. "Hey!" Stella slammed her hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "I am talking to you. Do you know who the hell I am? I will have this place shut down. I will have you destroyed." Neve finally turned her head to look down at Stella. The heiress was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her face flushed an ugly mottled red. Neve didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. "I know exactly who you are, Ms. Perry," Neve said, the words slipping out with a calm, surgical precision. "You are Arthur's daughter, and you are Leandro's sister." Neve let those words hang in the air. She didn't add any insults. She didn't call her a brat or a monster. She simply stated her titles, the only titles she had. The implication was heavy, devastating, and immediate. Stella's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from her face. Neve placed the folded linen napkin neatly on the edge of the table, right next to Stella's hand. "You're shaking," Neve pointed out, her tone dripping with pity, which was infinitely worse than anger. "And your mascara is flaking onto your cheek. You came in here to prove you belong at this table, but you're just throwing a tantrum because nobody here is actually afraid of you. They're afraid of the man sitting across from you." A pin could have dropped and sounded like a cymbal. The table of associates looked terrified, practically holding their breath. Stella looked like she had been slapped. She shot a panicked, desperate glance at Leandro, waiting for her brother to stand up, to pull a gun, to do something to defend her honor, to destroy this insolent waitress. Leandro didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Neve. A slow, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Neve reached up and began untying the soaked apron from her waist. She pulled it over her head and laid it carefully over the back of an empty chair. She wasn't rushing. She owned the pacing of the room. She reached into her slacks and pulled out a small wad of cash, mostly 5s and 10s, her tip money from the lunch shift. She peeled off a crisp $50 bill and dropped it directly onto Stella's pristine plate of sea bass. "For your dry cleaning," Neve said flatly, "in case you sweat through that mink coat. Have a good evening." Neve turned her back on the table. "In the world of the mafia, you never turned your back on a boss. You definitely never humiliated one's blood relative in public and just walked away. But Neve was tired, she was wet, and she was done." She walked toward the kitchen doors, her spine straight, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent restaurant. "Leandro!" Stella finally shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "Are you going to let her speak to me like that? Kill her! Do something!" Before Neve reached the doors, Leandro's voice rang out. It wasn't a yell. It was a firm, resonant command that hit the room like a physical shockwave. "Sit down, Stella." Neve paused, glancing over her shoulder. Stella had half risen from her chair, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. But at the sound of her brother's voice, she froze. "I said," Leandro repeated, his tone dropping an octave, radiating a terrifying, icy authority. "Sit down. You're embarrassing yourself, and you're embarrassing me." Stella collapsed into her chair as if her strings had been cut. She stared down at her lap, her hands trembling violently. Leandro picked up the $50 bill Neve had dropped on the fish. He folded it neatly in half, then in half again, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He looked across the room, locking eyes with Neve. There was no anger in his expression, no wounded pride. Instead, there was an intense, piercing curiosity. He looked at her the way a man dying of thirst looks at a glass of water. Neve didn't shrink under his gaze. She held it for 2 seconds, offered a microscopic, mock-polite nod, and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving the silence of the dining room behind her. Inside the kitchen, the chaos of the grills and shouting line cooks washed over her. Gerard came sprinting through the doors a second later, grabbing his thinning hair. "Brown, are you insane?" he wheezed, his face purple. "You're fired. You're dead. We're all dead." Neve walked over to the staff lockers, pulling her keys from her pocket. "I'm off the clock, Gerard. Mail me my final check." "You don't understand," Gerard hissed, blocking her path. "Leandro Perry doesn't just let things go. You humiliated his blood in front of his crew. He's going to find you." Neve slung her worn canvas backpack over her shoulder. She thought about the flat, dead eyes of Leandro Perry and the strange smirk he had worn when she dismantled his sister. She had crossed a line, she knew that. But as the cold, wet fabric of her shirt clung to her ribs, she realized she didn't care. "Let him," Neve said, pushing past the manager. "I could use the overtime." She walked out the alley door into the cool October night, unaware that inside the dining room, Leandro Perry was quietly demanding the manager bring him her employment file. The evening was over, but the game had just begun. Morning sunlight in apartment 4B had a way of highlighting failures. It illuminated the creeping water stain on the ceiling, the peeling linoleum near the stove, and the stack of final notice medical bills sitting on the cramped kitchen counter. Neve sat at her microscopic dining table, a mug of bitter instant coffee warming her hands. She watched her one-eared ginger cat, Barnaby, aggressively dismantle a cardboard box in the corner. Adrenaline always leaves a vicious hangover. Last night, pushing through the alley doors of Laura, Neve had felt 10 feet tall, a titan of the working class. Today, staring at her banking app through a web of cracks on her phone screen, she felt like a very tired 26-year-old with exactly $412 to her name. Rent was due in 6 days. The electric company was threatening a shutoff by Friday. She took a sip of the terrible coffee and rubbed her temples. Quitting a lucrative waitressing gig by publicly castigating a mafia princess was, objectively, a terrible financial strategy. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the front door shattered the quiet. Neve froze. Her first thought was the landlord. Her second, far more chilling thought was Gerard's panicked warning. Leandro Perry doesn't just let things go. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and crept to the door. She pressed her eye against the scratched brass peephole. It wasn't a squad of armed enforcers. It wasn't the police. It was a single man in a tailored charcoal overcoat, standing with his hands loosely clasped in front of him. Leandro Perry. He was looking directly at the peephole, as if he knew exactly where her eye was resting. Nevaeh's heart did a strange, heavy thump against her ribs. She didn't own a gun. She had a half-empty can of pepper spray in her purse and a heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove. Neither seemed particularly useful against the head of the city's most prolific crime syndicate. But hiding was pathetic, and Nevaeh hated feeling pathetic. She fastened the heavy brass chain lock and turned the deadbolt, opening the door just a few inches. Leandro didn't try to push it open. He stood perfectly still in the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked wildly out of place, a $1 million asset dropped into a crumbling tenement building. You live in a tough neighborhood, Nevaeh, Leandro said. His voice was that same low, resonant rumble from the restaurant. Casual, observational. It keeps the solicitors away, Nevaeh replied, keeping her face blank. How did you get my address? Leandro reached into his coat pocket. Nevi flinched, her hand tightening on the edge of the door, but he only pulled out a manila folder. He tapped it lightly against the doorframe. Your manager, Gerard. He was very accommodating. He also gave me your employment file, a copy of your driver's license, and your emergency contacts. He's a terrified little man. You shouldn't trust him with your paperwork. I don't trust him with anything. Why are you here, Mr. Perry? If you came to shoot me for upsetting your sister, I'd appreciate it if you did it in the hall. I don't want my cat to eat my security deposit. A flicker of genuine amusement crossed Leandro's flat brown eyes. It was a subtle shift, a slight easing of the tension around his jaw. I didn't come to shoot you. May I come in? Nevaeh looked at him. She looked at the heavy, expensive fabric of his coat, the meticulous knot of his tie, the cold intelligence radiating from him. Keeping him in the hallway felt like a stall tactic she couldn't maintain. Slowly, she shut the door, unhooked the chain, and swung it wide open. Leandro stepped inside. The apartment instantly felt significantly smaller. He didn't pace, and he didn't touch anything. He stood near the kitchenette, his eyes doing a slow, clinical sweep of the room. He cataloged the worn thrift store sofa, the dying pothos plant by the window, and the towering stack of hospital bills on the counter. His gaze lingered there for a fraction of a second before returning to her. You didn't run, Leandro observed. Most people who cross my family pack a bag and try to catch a Greyhound to Ohio by sunrise. I can't afford a bus ticket to Ohio, Nevaeh said, crossing her arms over her oversized gray sweater. And I have a shift at a diner across town at noon. What do you want? Leandro tossed the manila folder onto her small dining table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative slap. I want to understand what happened last night, Leandro said, turning to face her fully. Stella has been terrorizing the staff at Laura for 3 years. I've watched hostesses cry. I've watched grown men who run illegal gambling rings for me, stutter and apologize to her because they're terrified of my last name. But you didn't. She spilled water on me. People have spilled worse on you, I imagine. Leandro tilted his head, stepping slightly closer. The scent of him, cedar, cold air, and something sharp and metallic, invaded her space. You didn't just stand up to her, Neve. You surgically dismantled her. You found the exact nerve that controls her ego, and you severed it in front of an audience, without raising your voice. I was tired, Neve said simply. I don't have the energy to coddle insecure rich women. If that offended you, do what you have to do. It didn't offend me, Leandro said softly. It impressed me. Neve blinked, her carefully maintained wall of apathy cracking just a millimeter. Excuse me? My organization is transitioning, Leandro explained, slipping his hands into his pockets. My father ran things with a hammer. He surrounded himself with animals who only understood blunt force. I am building something different. Legitimate fronts, casinos, high-end hospitality, real estate. But I am surrounded by thugs who can't navigate polite society and sycophants who agree with every word I say out of fear. He stepped up to the table, resting his fingertips on the manila folder. I need people who can maintain absolute control in volatile situations, Leandro continued. People who don't break under pressure. People who aren't afraid of a last name. Neve stared at him, the absurdity of the situation washing over her. Are you offering me a job? I am. As what? Your waitress? Your enforcer? I don't break kneecaps, Mr. Perry. You don't need to. I have plenty of men for that. Leandro pulled a sleek silver business card from his pocket and laid it on top of her file. I recently acquired the Oak Haven, a private members club downtown. It caters to a very specific, very difficult clientele. Politicians, hedge fund managers, and people in my line of work. It requires a floor manager who cannot be intimidated. Someone who can look a violent man in the eye and tell him his table isn't ready, and make him believe it. Neve let out a short, breathless laugh. You want me to babysit criminals? I want you to manage my most valuable asset, Leandro corrected. Your salary would be triple what Gerard was paying you at Laura. Full medical benefits, and a signing bonus sufficient to clear that stack of papers on your counter. He gestured vaguely toward the medical bills. Nevaeh felt a sudden, hot spike of violation. You read my file, she snapped, her posture rigid. You looked into my mother's hospital debt. I run a thorough background check on any potential investment, Leandro said, completely unapologetic. You owe $84,000 to County General for palliative care. You work 60 hours a week between two jobs. You have no criminal record, and you possess a psychological baseline that borders on the sociopathic, given how calm you were last night. I am not a sociopath, Neve fired back, her voice finally rising. I'm just exhausted. Then let me pay you enough to sleep, Leandro countered smoothly. The silence in the room grew heavy. Barnaby the cat jumped onto the kitchen counter, knocking over a plastic cup, but neither human flinched. Neve looked at the silver card on the table. The money he was talking about was life-changing. It was the difference between drowning and breathing. But the money came with strings thick enough to hang herself with. You think you can buy me? Neve said quietly. Her eyes traced the sharp lines of his face. He wasn't classically handsome. His features were too severe, too carved out by stress and violence. But he possessed a magnetic, undeniable gravity. I know I can buy your time, Leandro corrected. Loyalty is something else entirely. We would have to earn that from each other. And if Stella walks into this club? Neve asked, raising an eyebrow. Am I supposed to fetch her sparkling water and take her abuse? If Stella walks into the club and acts out of line, you will have my full authority to have security throw her onto the sidewalk." Leandro said it without a trace of hesitation. It was a cold, brutal admission of where his family loyalties ended and his business began. Nevaeh walked over to the table and picked up the business card. It was heavy stock, embossed with a simple silver oak tree and a phone number. No name, no title. "Why me?" Nevaeh asked, her voice dropping, stripping away the armor of sarcasm. "Really? You have money. You can hire hospitality veterans from Manhattan or London. Why the waitress who poured a glass of ice water over your family name?" Leandro took a slow breath. For the first time since he walked into her apartment, the clinical corporate mask slipped, revealing something darker and infinitely more tired underneath. "Because everyone in my world lies to me, Nevaeh," he said, the words carrying a heavy, metallic weight. "They smile, they bow, and they tell me what I want to hear while they plot to take my chair. When you looked at my sister last night, you didn't see a Perry. You saw a terrified little girl in a mink coat. And when you looked at me, you weren't afraid." He took a step closer, leaving only a foot of space between them. Nevaeh had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "I need someone in my orbit who tells me the truth," Leandro murmured. "Even when it's ugly. Especially when it's ugly. You don't care about my money, and you don't care about my reputation. That makes you the most dangerous person I've met in years. I'd rather have you on my payroll than working at a diner." Nevaeh's grip on the business card tightened. She felt the terrifying magnetic pull of the world he was offering. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the power. The ability to never be pushed around by a manager like Gerard or a client like Stella ever again. Leandro wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a weapon. "I don't know anything about running a private club," Nevaeh said, her voice barely a whisper. "You know how to read people," Leandro replied. "The rest is just inventory." He reached into his pocket one last time. He pulled out the crisp $50 bill Nevaeh had dropped on Stella's fish the night before. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the fabric of her sweater, and tucked the bill under the edge of the manila folder. "Your change," Leandro said softly. He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned, his coat sweeping behind him, and unlatched the front door. He paused on the threshold, the dim hallway light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. "The club opens at 8 tomorrow evening. Dress in black. If you show up, the debts are cleared by Monday. If you don't, I wish you the best of luck with the diner." The door clicked shut. Nevaeh stood alone in her apartment. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and cold street air. She looked at the $50 bill, then at the stack of final notices, and finally at the heavy silver card in her hand. She had spent her entire life trying to stay away from the shadows, playing by the rules of a rigged game that only left her bruised and broke. She walked over to the stove, picked up the mug of cold, instant coffee, and poured it down the sink. Black is a color of mourning, but tonight it was a tactical choice. Nevaeh adjusted the collar of the structured, tailored dress she had unearthed from a consignment shop rack 3 hours earlier. It was stark, devoid of embellishment, and fit her like a layer of Kevlar. She stood beneath the amber glow of a street lamp, staring at the matte black facade of the Oak Haven. There were no neon signs advertising its existence, no velvet ropes, just a solid oak door with a heavy brass handle and a security camera nestled discreetly into the brickwork above. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp October air fill her lungs. Then she walked up the 3 stone steps and pulled the door open. The transition from the noisy street to the interior of the club was like stepping into a vacuum. The air inside was heavy and climate-controlled, smelling faintly of old leather, expensive bourbon, and the subtle, sharp tang of ozone. The lighting was impossibly low, cast from frosted wall sconces that illuminated the edges of the room while leaving the center bathed in shadow. Soft, slow jazz drifted from a speaker system she couldn't see. Name. The voice came from a massive man standing just inside the foyer. He wore a tuxedo that strained against his shoulders, and an earpiece curled around his jawline. His eyes were entirely dead. "Nevaeh Brown," she said, her voice steady. "Leandro Perry expects me." The giant didn't blink. He pressed a finger to his ear, murmured something indiscernible, and stepped aside. "Mr. Perry is in the mezzanine office. The floor is yours, Ms. Brown. I'm Hugo. If you need a body removed, nod twice." Nevaeh stared at him for a fraction of a second to see if he was joking. He wasn't. "Noted. Thank you, Hugo." She bypassed the coat check and stepped out onto the main floor. Laura had been an exercise in pretentious wealth. The Oak Haven was something entirely different. It was the architecture of power. Men in bespoke suits sat in deep velvet booths, their heads leaned close together in hushed, urgent conversations. There were politicians whose faces she recognized from local attack ads, sitting across from men sporting broken noses and knuckle tattoos. It was the quiet, luxurious intersection where the legitimate world bought favors from the illegitimate one. Nevaeh moved through the room with practiced invisibility, cataloging the layout. 3 exits. A curved mahogany bar lined with premium crystal. A private poker room tucked behind a set of frosted glass doors in the back. Waitresses moved between the tables, carrying silver trays, their expressions carefully blank. "Excuse me," a sharp, impatient voice cut through the ambient hum. Nevaeh pivoted. A man in his late 50s, his face flushed with alcohol and irritation, was snapping his fingers at a passing waitress. The waitress, a young woman who looked barely 20, froze, her tray trembling slightly. Nevaeh recognized the man instantly. It was City Councilman David Sterling. Wait, no, David Caldwell. A man who built his career on anti-corruption platforms while clearly spending his Thursday nights in a mob-owned speakeasy. "I asked for a Macallan 18, neat," Caldwell slurred slightly, glaring at the waitress. "This has ice in it. Are you completely incompetent?" the young woman stammered. Sir, I'm sorry, the bartender..." Nevaeh didn't think. She simply stepped into the space between the terrified waitress and the angry politician. She took the glass from the tray with one hand and offered Caldwell a polite, entirely deadpan smile. "My apologies, Councilman Caldwell," Nevaeh said, her voice a soothing, low hum. "There was a miscommunication at the bar. We will replace this immediately." Caldwell sneered at her, emboldened by the alcohol. "And who the hell are you? The head idiot?" "I am the floor manager," Nevaeh replied, not breaking eye contact, "and I am ensuring your evening remains as discreet and pleasant as you require, especially considering your wife, Brenda, believes you are currently at a zoning board retreat in Albany." The color drained from Caldwell's face with comical speed. The belligerence evaporated, replaced by a sudden, choking panic. He looked around frantically to see if anyone at the neighboring tables had heard. Neve hadn't read a file on Caldwell. She just read the local newspaper and had an excellent memory for details. "I'll have that neat McAllen brought right over to you, David," Neve continued, her tone never shifting from pleasant customer service. "Please, enjoy the jazz. It's excellent tonight." She turned, handed the iced whiskey back to the stunned waitress, and gestured toward the bar. "Go tell the bartender to pour a fresh one. Take a deep breath. You're fine." The waitress nodded furiously and practically ran toward the mahogany counter. Neve smoothed the front of her black dress, feeling the adrenaline burn through her veins. It wasn't the frantic, desperate survival instinct she felt at her old jobs. This was different. This was control. High above the floor, obscured by the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, a match flared. Neve glanced up. Leandro Perry stood near the railing, the flame of his lighter briefly illuminating the sharp angles of his face before he touched it to the end of a cigar. He had watched the entire interaction. Even from 30 feet below, Neve could feel the heavy, approving weight of his stare. He didn't gesture for her to come up. He simply exhaled a plume of blue smoke, turned, and disappeared back into the darkness of his office. The silent message was clear. You belong down there. Own it. For the next 4 hours, Neve did exactly that. She redirected a drunken hedge fund manager to a cab before he could vomit on a Persian rug. She calmly informed a low-level enforcer that his firearm was showing through his jacket and politely suggested he check it with Hugo. She moved through the club like a ghost, fixing problems before they materialized into violence. By midnight, the frantic, terrified energy that usually plagued the staff had settled into a smooth, oiled rhythm. They realized quickly that the new manager wasn't there to yell at them. She was there to act as a buffer between them and the monsters they served. At 2 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the Oakhaven locked from the inside. The last of the politicians had stumbled to their waiting town cars, and the handful of made men had retreated to the back alleys. The club was quiet, save for the clinking of glass as the bar staff wiped down the counters. Neve stood near the host stand, her feet aching in familiar, dull thumps, but her mind was fiercely awake. She was reviewing the night's receipts when a shadow fell across the ledger. "Come upstairs." Neve looked up. Leandro was standing a few feet away. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white button-down shirt unfastened at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle and faded ink. The corporate facade was stripped back, leaving only the raw, dangerous reality of the man underneath. He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and walked toward the winding iron staircase that led to the mezzanine. Neve closed the ledger, handed it to the head bartender, and followed him. Leandro's office was a massive, soundproof glass cube suspended over the back half of the club. It was aggressively minimalist. A massive slab of dark walnut served as a desk, completely clear of clutter. No family photos, no trophies. The only personal item in the room was a heavy crystal decanter sitting on a side table. Leandro walked over to the table and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a tumbler. He didn't ask if she wanted one. He simply held it out to her. Neve took the glass. Their fingers brushed. His skin was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold, dead-eyed persona he projected to the world. "Councilman Caldwell," Leandro said, leaning his hip against the edge of his walnut desk. "You threatened a sitting city official within 10 minutes of clocking in." "I didn't threaten him," Neve replied, taking a small sip of the bourbon. It burned a smooth, fiery path down her throat. I gently reminded him of his priorities. He was accelerating toward a public tantrum, which would have disrupted the room and drawn unnecessary attention. You said you wanted absolute control. That was control. A slow, genuine smile cracked Leandro's severe features. It transformed his face, making him look devastatingly human for a fleeting second. Hugo told me you didn't even blink when he offered to hide a body for you, Leandro noted, crossing his arms. I've worked in food service for 8 years, Mr. Perry. Hiding a body is just sanitation protocol. Leandro laughed. It was a low, rough sound that vibrated in the quiet office. Leandro, when we are in this room, you call me Leandro. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it between his index and middle fingers, extending it toward her. Your signing bonus. Nevaeh approached the desk and took the paper. She unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a check. It was a printed receipt from County General Hospital's billing department. Patient, Margaret Brown. Account balance, $0, 0. Status, paid in full. Nevaeh stared at the black ink. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. $84,000. The weight that had been crushing her chest for 2 years, the debt that had dictated every miserable shift, every skipped meal, every sleepless night, gone. Wiped out by a single keystroke from a man who ran an empire built on extortion and blood. Her hands began to shake. She hated it, but she couldn't stop the microscopic tremor. Why? Nevaeh whispered, her voice tightening. She looked up from the paper, locking eyes with him. This isn't a salary advance. This is leverage. You want me to owe you. No, Leandro said softly. He pushed off the desk, taking a slow step toward her. The predatory stillness returned to his posture. Leverage is what I use on men like Caldwell. Leverage implies I have to force you to stay. I paid that debt because I want you to work for me out of choice, not out of desperation. Nobody in your world does anything without a hook, Leandro. You're right, he admitted, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He stopped inches from her. She could smell the bourbon on his breath, mixed with the ever-present scent of cedar. My hook is that I want your undivided attention. I don't want you exhausted. I don't want you worrying about men in cheap suits calling your phone for collections. I want your mind sharp, and I want it focused entirely on my operation. He reached out. For a second, Nevaeh thought he was going to touch her face. Every nerve ending in her body flared, a confusing cocktail of fear and intense, undeniable magnetism. But his hand bypassed her cheek, his fingers lightly tapping the hospital receipt she was clutching. You're safe here, Nevaeh, Leandro murmured, his dark eyes searching hers. I know you've spent your entire life fighting to survive, but you don't have to fight the house anymore. You run the house. Nevaeh swallowed hard. She looked at the receipt, then back at him. She saw the profound isolation in his eyes, the crushing loneliness of a king who couldn't trust his own court. He hadn't just bought a manager tonight. He had bought an ally. And standing there in the dim light of the glass office, Nevaeh realized she didn't want to leave. The underworld didn't scare her anymore. The civilian world, with its crushing debts and polite cruelties, was infinitely worse. If I'm running the floor, Nevaeh said, her voice finding its steel once again, I need full autonomy over the roster. I want 2 of the current bartenders fired by Friday. They're skimming off the top of the cash registers. They're clumsy about it, and it's insulting to watch. Leandro held her gaze for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to carve with a knife. Then his eyes gleamed with absolute predatory approval. "Consider them gone," Leandro said quietly. Nevaeh lifted her glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. "Then I suppose we have a deal." Leandro mirrored her gesture, lifting his own glass. They didn't toast. They didn't need to. The clinking of glasses was for celebrations, and this wasn't a celebration. It was a pact, a silent agreement drawn in the shadows of a corrupt city, between a woman with nothing left to lose and a man with everything to protect. 6 weeks was all it took to rewire the nervous system of an empire. Within a month and a half, Nevaeh had transformed the Oak Haven from a high-priced watering hole for thugs into an impregnable fortress of discretion. She fired 3 more staff members after the initial 2 bartenders, 1 for showing up high, 2 for gossiping about a city judge's gambling debts. She replaced them with hospitality veterans who valued a massive paycheck over their own egos. The floor staff stopped walking on eggshells. They stopped looking over their shoulders. Nevaeh absorbed the anxiety of the room so they didn't have to. She wore her uniform like armor. Tonight, it was a charcoal blazer cut sharp at the shoulders, paired with tailored trousers. She stood near the frosted glass doors of the private poker room, watching a state senator lose $20,000 to a man who ran the docks. She didn't judge. She just made sure their crystal tumblers never ran dry. Then the ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet. Nevaeh didn't need to look at the front door to know something was wrong. She felt it in the subtle shift of the floor staff. A waitress near the host stand froze, her tray dipping slightly. Hugo, standing his usual post by the entrance, straightened his spine, a heavy frown pulling at his scarred jawline. Nevaeh turned smoothly on her heel and began navigating through the velvet booths. Stella Perry had finally found out where the waitress went. She stood in the foyer, flanked by 2 men in cheap, shiny suits who looked entirely out of place among the bespoke tailoring of the club's regulars. Stella was wearing a crimson dress that screamed for attention, a stark contrast to the muted, powerful shadows of the Oak Haven. She was practically vibrating with frantic, nervous energy, her eyes scanning the dark interior with a mixture of awe and deep, consuming jealousy. This was her brother's crown jewel, a place she was rarely invited. "I don't need a reservation," Stella's shrill voice cut through the soft jazz. She jabbed a manicured finger into Hugo's massive chest. "I am Leandro's sister. Tell whoever is managing this floor to get me the corner booth. Now." Hugo didn't flinch. He didn't even look down at her finger. He looked over her shoulder, meeting Nevaeh's eyes as she approached. "Ms. Perry," Nevaeh said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a crisp, cutting authority that snapped Stella's attention away from the bouncer. Stella turned, a sneer already forming on her lips, ready to dress down whatever subordinate had dared to address her. But when her eyes landed on Nevaeh, the sneer faltered. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes widening in a visceral shock that was almost comical to witness. Nevaeh didn't look like the exhausted, water-soaked waitress from Laura. She looked like the physical embodiment of the club itself, cold, expensive, and entirely untouchable. "You," Stella breathed, the color rushing to her cheeks. She took a step forward, a sudden, ugly fury overriding her shock. "What the hell are you doing here? Did Leandro buy you as a pet? Get out of my way and fetch me a manager." "I am the manager, Stella," Nevaeh replied. She didn't use an honorific. She didn't call her Ms. Perry. She stripped away the title, leaving only the terrified woman underneath. The two enforcers standing behind Stella shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting around the room, realizing exactly whose territory they had just walked into. "You're lying," Stella hissed, stepping close enough that Nevaeh could smell the sharp, overwhelming floral notes of her perfume. "My brother would never put a piece of trash like you in charge of this place. You humiliated me." "I served you your fish," Nevaeh corrected smoothly, keeping her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "Your reaction to it was entirely your own. Now, the club is at capacity tonight. If you would like to be added to the wait list, I can have Hugo take your name. Otherwise, I will have to ask you to clear the foyer. You are blocking the entrance." It was a beautiful, surgical dismissal. Nevaeh didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult her. She treated the Mafia princess like a mildly irritating telemarketer. Several patrons sitting at the bar had turned to watch. They were heavy hitters, men who controlled the city's concrete and sanitation contracts. They watched Stella Perry, the infamous brat of the family, getting boxed out by the new floor manager with effortless precision. "I am not waiting on a list!" Stella shrieked, finally losing the fragile grip on her temper. "I own this city. I own you. I want you thrown out on the street right now, or I will have these men break your legs." She gestured wildly to the two thugs behind her. Nevaeh slowly shifted her gaze to the two men. She didn't glare. She just looked at them with a flat, absolute boredom. "Hugo," Nevaeh said quietly, never taking her eyes off the thugs. "If either of these gentlemen takes a step past the coat check, break their jaws and leave them in the alley for the garbage trucks." Hugo smiled. It was a terrifying, jagged thing. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like dry branches snapping in a quiet forest. "My pleasure, Ms. Brown." The two men instantly took a step back, holding their hands up in universal surrender. They were low-level muscle. They weren't paid enough to fight Leandro Perry's personal head of security inside Leandro Perry's personal club. Stella looked back at her retreating backup, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. She was stranded on an island of her own making, stripped of her armor, facing a woman who felt no fear. "You're dead!" Stella spat, tears of absolute frustration welling in her eyes. "When Leandro hears about this, you are dead. He already has." Gravity seemed to shift in the room. Nevaeh didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of those footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken violence. Leandro emerged from the shadows of the club's interior, walking past the mahogany bar. He was wearing a black dress shirt, no tie, his dark eyes locked entirely on his sister. The ambient chatter in the room died instantly. The jazz music suddenly felt too loud. Stella's face lit up with a desperate, frantic relief. "Leandro, thank God! This bitch is threatening me. She ordered Hugo to attack my men. You need to fire her. You need to make an example of her right now." Leandro stopped beside Nevaeh. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The physical proximity was a statement in itself. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his floor manager, presenting an impenetrable, unified front. He looked at the two thugs backing away toward the door. "Who do you work for?" The taller of the two swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Jimmy Rossi, Mr. Perry. We were just told to escort your sister. We didn't want any trouble. Tell Jimmy Rossi he owes me $10,000 for the disruption. And if I ever see your faces near my property again, Hugo won't stop at your jaws." Leandro's voice was a low rumble, devoid of anger, but packed with lethal promise. The two men didn't hesitate. They practically sprinted out the heavy oak doors, abandoning Stella in the foyer. Stella watched them go, her jaw trembling. She looked back at her brother, the betrayal radiating from her posture. "Leandro, what are you doing? I am your blood. She is a nobody, a waitress." "She is the house, Stella," Leandro said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register that forced everyone in the room to strain to hear it. "This club operates on respect. It operates on order. You bring nothing but chaos and entitlement wherever you go. I warned you to stay away from my business." "I am your family," Stella screamed, a tear finally spilling over her mascara. "My family respects me," Leandro countered smoothly, his face an emotionless mask. "You just use my name to terrorize people because you have absolutely nothing else to offer the world. You are a liability, and I do not tolerate liabilities inside the Oak Haven." Stella recoiled as if he had physically struck her. The words were brutal, precise, and entirely accurate. He had just severed her only source of power in front of half the city's underworld. "Now," Leandro continued, turning his body slightly to acknowledge Nevaeh, "Ms. Brown asked you to leave. I suggest you do it before I have Hugo carry you out." Stella looked from her brother's cold eyes to Nevaeh's completely neutral face. There was no victory smirk on Nevaeh's lips. There was just an unshakable, profound indifference. That indifference was the final nail in the coffin. Stella turned, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she were physically wounded, and pushed through the heavy doors. The cold October night swallowed her whole. The heavy doors clicked shut. Silence hung in the foyer for a long, heavy 3 seconds. "Hugo," Nevaeh said, breaking the quiet with a perfectly level tone. "Close the vestibule doors. There's a draft." "Yes, ma'am," Hugo grunted, stepping forward to secure the heavy interior glass. The tension in the room instantly dissolved. The low hum of conversation resumed at the bar. The crisis had been averted, handled with a bloodless, terrifying efficiency. The patrons looked at Nevaeh with a new, profound reverence. She wasn't just a manager anymore. She was a protected asset. She was untouchable. Leandro didn't walk away. He stood beside Nevaeh, watching the street through the frosted glass. "You handled that well," he murmured, his voice meant only for her. "I handled it exactly how you pay me to handle it," Nevaeh replied, though her pulse was finally beginning to slow from its frantic galloping. Leandro turned his head, looking down at her. The cold corporate mask he wore for the room slipped away, leaving only the intense, searching gaze she had seen in her apartment 6 weeks ago. "You didn't need me to step in," he noted. "No, but I appreciate that you did." Nevaeh met his eyes. "You humiliated her to prove a point." "I told her the truth," Leandro corrected, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. The scent of cedar and expensive bourbon washed over her. Something she desperately needed to hear, and something this room needed to see. They need to know that your authority is absolute. "Because it makes the business run smoother?" Nevaeh asked, a cynical edge to her voice. Leandro reached out. It wasn't a hesitant gesture. His hand brushed against her arm, his fingers lightly tracing the cuff of her charcoal blazer. It was a fleeting, electric touch that sent a jolt of heat straight to her chest. Because I protect what is mine, Leandro said softly. He didn't wait for her to process the weight of that statement. He dropped his hand, turned, and walked back toward the iron staircase that led to his glass office. Neve stood in the foyer, the faint warmth of his touch lingering on her wrist. She looked around the dimly lit room, at the politicians nursing their whiskey, the maid men playing poker, and the waitstaff moving with quiet, confident efficiency. A month ago, she was drowning in a sea of medical debt, letting insecure brats spill ice water on her shoes just to make rent. Now she stood at the epicenter of the city's power structure, backed by a man who treated violence like a chess game and treated her like a queen. Money didn't buy class, and it certainly didn't buy happiness. But as Neve adjusted her blazer and walked back onto the floor to check on the state senator's glass, she realized it bought something infinitely better. It bought leverage, and she was never letting go of it again. If you love the quiet power and high stakes of Neve and Leandro's story, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with a friend who loves a deeply grounded mafia romance where the heroine actually fights back with her brain, not just attitude. Want more stories of power, tension, and undeniable chemistry? Make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept the $50 bill or thrown it back? Let's talk about it.